We are now joined by John Hardie, the director of the Russia program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. John, it's good to have you with us. Let's talk about what Russia's interest in this conflict has been and what they're gaining from it.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I think overall it's important to remember that Russia is a fairly marginal player in this conflict. Its ability to influence events on the ground and the thinking of the various players involved is fairly limited. But it has gained a lot from the conflict. As you mentioned, it's distracted global attention from Russia's own war in Ukraine. It allows Moscow to present itself as kind of a more responsible party and curry favor with some capitals that support the Palestinians against Israel. I think another important element is Russia's burgeoning relationship with Iran. I wouldn't go so far as to say Moscow and Tehran are really allies, but certainly they're both investing in that partnership, and that could be one reason why Russia's response to the current Gaza war has been really more pro-Palestinian in contrast to its traditional attempts to kind of keep good relations with Israel.
John, do you see a good or simple way to break the connection between Russia and Iran, given how much damage Iran has done to the region here?
No, unfortunately, I don't. I think in Moscow, the war in Ukraine is really all-consuming. And that affects how Moscow looks at its relationships with different countries, including in the Middle East. So the priorities is getting drones, it's getting artillery ammunition, other material from Iran. If Iran can provide that, I think Tehran gains some kind of bargaining power vis-a-vis Moscow. I think the one check really could be Moscow does want to maintain good relations with the Gulf Arab countries and even with Israel, despite its kind of bellicose rhetoric. So I don't think the Russians want to go all in with Iran, so to speak. So to an extent, the Gulf countries, Israel, others, might be able to kind of lobby Moscow not to, say, sell Su-35 fighter jets to Iran.
You mentioned that Russia's a minor player in this specific conflict. That said, Russia has always historically been a major influence in the Middle East, particularly with Israel's enemies. Are they only marginalized as long as the war in Ukraine is taking all of their attention and their resources and, most importantly, their weapon systems from the region? Or are they going to be back in force?
Sure. So obviously, Russia does have there's some military presence in the region, most notably in Syria, and its bases there. But it's really kind of an economy of force operation. I don't think they have the appetite or capability for anything like a U.S.-style military presence in the region. But there are a lot of ways they can influence events, or at least create the appearance of influence through kind of on the cheap. This reported deal to send a Pantsir air defense system to Hezbollah through the Wagner Group is one example. I don't think that Pantsir will make a huge difference for Hezbollah or for Israeli air operations, but it's a way Moscow can kind of get itself in the headlines and kind of remind regional players that, hey, we're here too.
Let's talk about what relation Russia and Hamas seem to have.
Right, so obviously they've had ties going back to the 2000s. I think originally, funnily enough, the Russians saw potential, relations with Hamas as a way to sort of be of use to the West. Obviously, as Russia's own relationship with the West has deteriorated, I think the Russians still see that relationship with Hamas as leverage, but maybe in a more nefarious way, leverage against the West, right? So overall, obviously the Russians hosted a Hamas delegation since the war began. I still see these ties as relatively modest. At least to my knowledge, the Russians have not been providing military weapons directly to Hamas. If that were to change, obviously, I think we'd be in a kind of a different ball game in terms of their relations and Russia's impact on the conflict.
John, with everything we're seeing in the region, is there a strain of thought in Russia's leadership that perhaps Hamas is not so much an asset against the West as it is too volatile to be an asset to anybody? It could be a liability to Russia as well.
That's a great question. I think in Syria, the Russians probably saw that on the one hand, these groups, Iran-backed groups, can be difficult to control, and I think the Russians know that ultimately these groups are not going to answer to Russia. They're not going to be a Russian proxy. So you have to be careful when you're investing, in these groups. That being said, I think Russia in general, as I touched on before, likes a strategy where there's minimal investment and high rewards. So I mentioned the pantsir to Hezbollah. That's a great example where you're not doing much. You can get a good bit of reward in terms of political rewards, in terms of just making your presence felt, in terms of media attention. But that doesn't necessarily augur a sort of strong Hezbollah-Russia axis.
Well, thank you very much for helping us understand just what role they had in the region. Thank you very much, John, for joining us.